Jack Williams pulled his car into the driveway earlier than planned, the engine ticking as it cooled, while dusk settled over the quiet suburban street. The business trip had wrapped up faster than expected, and for the first time in months, he felt a small, almost forgotten anticipation. An evening at home with no meetings, no deadlines, just the familiar rhythm of his life. He grabbed his bag, walked up the steps, and unlocked the front door as softly as habit allowed, already imagining Emily in the kitchen, maybe a glass of wine waiting, maybe a tired smile meant just for him. The sound hit him before he fully stepped inside. Laughter drifted from the living room, sharp, bright, and wrong. It wasn't the gentle, shared amusement of family settling into the evening. It was louder, careless, edged with something that made Jack slow his steps. He paused in the hallway, keys still in his hand, listening. The laughter spiked again, followed by a muffled voice he didn't expect to hear, so relaxed, so at home. His chest tightened. Jack moved forward, his footsteps heavy now, each one carrying a growing sense that he was walking into something he hadn't been invited to understand. When he reached the living room doorway, the scene froze him in place. Emily sat on the couch, her face streaked with tears, shoulders drawn inward as if she were collapsing under a private weight. But she wasn't alone. Daniel was there, his son sitting far too close, leaning back comfortably, a half smile still lingering on his face as if he'd just finished a joke. And flanking them were Emily's parents, settled into Jack's furniture with the ease of people who believed they belonged there. For a moment, no one noticed him. Jack's eyes moved from one face to the next, trying to make sense of what didn't fit. Emily crying, Daniel laughing. That alone felt like a contradiction his mind refused to resolve. His son's posture was casual, loose, as if this wasn't an emotionally charged moment, but an ordinary gathering. The sight of it sent a quiet, unfamiliar ache through Jack's chest. Finally, Emily looked up. Her eyes widened slightly, and she reached up to wipe her cheeks, smearing the last evidence of tears away with practiced urgency. But when their eyes met, Jack felt something colder than anger settle in his gut. There was an emptiness in her gaze he had never seen before, not sadness, not guilt, but a hollow distance, as if she were already somewhere else. Jack, she said softly, her voice too controlled for someone who had just been crying. Daniel shifted beside her, the smile fading as he leaned forward, suddenly fascinated by the floor. He didn't look at his father, not even for a second. That avoidance cut deeper than any sharp word could have. Jack had raised his son to meet problems head-on, to stand tall. Now, Daniel's silence felt deliberate. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again. His thoughts tangled, each one chasing the next without catching hold. Why was Daniel here like this? Why were Emily's parents seated so comfortably, as if they'd been part of the household all along? And why did it feel like he had walked into the aftermath of something already decided? Emily's mother, Lori, turned toward him last. Her lips curved into a thin, composed smile that never reached her eyes. It was polite, controlled, cold, the kind of smile that acknowledged his presence without welcoming it. Jack had seen that expression before, usually aimed at strangers she didn't respect. Jack, she said evenly, as if he were late to a meeting instead of early to his own life. No one stood. No one explained. The room felt smaller by the second, the air thick with words that refused to be spoken. Jack took a step forward, his bag slipping from his hand and hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have. Still, no one moved to help him, or even reacted. His confusion hardened into something heavier, an instinctive understanding that whatever this was, it had been happening without him for some time. That the laughter he'd heard wasn't meant for his ears, that the tears weren't meant to be explained. Jack remained in the doorway, suspended between the life he thought he was returning to and the one silently unfolding in front of him. Betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, settling into his bones as he realized he was the only one in the room who didn't know what was really going on. Jack lowered himself into the armchair opposite the couch, the worn leather creaking beneath his weight. It felt wrong to sit, wrong to pretend this was a normal conversation, but his legs wouldn't hold him any longer. He set his hands on his knees, grounding himself, and looked directly at Emily. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air, simple and heavy at the same time. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered, as if each word had to fight its way out. She started with nothing small phrases, half explanations that circled the truth without touching it. She said she'd been overwhelmed. She said there had been a misunderstanding. None of it added up, and she seemed to know it, because her eyes kept darting away from his, searching the room for someone to save her. Daniel shifted beside her, the movement sharp and restless. Jack noticed the way his son's knee bounced, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh. It was a nervous habit Daniel had as a boy, one he only slipped into when he felt cornered. Jack hadn't seen it in years. "I should get going," Daniel said suddenly, standing too fast. "I've got an early morning." No one asked him to stay. No one tried to stop him. As Daniel grabbed his jacket, his eyes finally met Jack's. The look wasn't apologetic. It wasn't defiant either. It was something stranger, a quick, guarded glance that carried unease, maybe even calculation. Then, it was gone. Daniel stepped past his father without another word and walked out the front door, leaving behind a silence that felt deliberate. Jack followed the sound of the door closing with his eyes, his jaw tightening. Something about that exit felt rehearsed. Lori cleared her throat, smoothing the fabric of her blouse as if she were resetting the room. "Jack, really, you came in at a difficult moment," she said calmly. "Emily's been under a lot of stress. We were just trying to comfort her." Her tone was gentle, reasonable, too reasonable. Jack had known Lori for decades, long enough to recognize when she was managing a situation instead of telling the truth. His instincts stirred, sharp and insistent. This wasn't concern, it was control. "I see," Jack replied, though he didn't feel like he saw anything at all. Emily's tears had slowed, but the sadness on her face didn't soften. If anything, it deepened into something heavier, something unresolved. Jack studied her, the slight turn of her body away from him, the way her hands twisted together in her lap. This wasn't just about tonight. This distance had been growing quietly for months, hidden in late dinners, distracted conversations, and the subtle sense that she was always somewhere else, even when she sat beside him. "Emily," Jack said, leaning forward now, lowering his voice. "Talk to me, please." She shook her head, a small, defeated motion. "I don't know how," she whispered. The answer landed like a warning. Jack pressed gently at first, asking about her tears, about Daniel, about why her parents had been there when he walked in. Each question was met with vague replies, phrases that dissolved as soon as they were spoken. "It's complicated. You wouldn't understand." "It's not what you think." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and that was when Jack felt it, a sharp, sinking realization. Guilt. Not confusion, not fear. Guilt. His chest tightened. "Is there something going on between you and Daniel that I should know about?" he asked, choosing his words carefully, testing the air. Emily flinched, just barely, but it was enough. "No," she said too quickly. "Of course not." But the denial lacked conviction, and Jack hated himself for the thought forming in his mind. He couldn't see the shape of the truth yet, couldn't bring himself to name it, but something about the way she avoided the question told him he was circling something dangerous. Emily stood abruptly. "I need a moment," she said, brushing past him as she headed down the hallway. I need to compose myself." Jack watched her go, listening to the bedroom door close softly behind her. The house felt hollow without her presence, even though she was still inside it. Lori gathered her purse soon after, offering another tight smile before leaving as well, promising to check in later. When Jack was finally alone, the quiet pressed in on him. He stared at the empty space where his son had stood, then at the hallway where his wife had disappeared. A deep sense of dread settled over him, not panic, not anger yet, but the cold understanding that this moment was a fracture. Whatever was happening in his family, it wasn't accidental. And as Jack sat there, replaying every look, every pause, every unfinished sentence, he knew one thing with unsettling clarity. He couldn't afford to stay in the dark any longer. Jack didn't sleep that night. He lay beside Emily, staring at the ceiling as the hours crawled forward, listening to the shallow rhythm of her breathing. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned, the sound of laughter, Daniel's easy posture, the way Emily's tears had stopped too quickly. He told himself he was overthinking it, that families had awkward moments, that stress made people act strangely, but the feeling wouldn't loosen its grip. Betrayal, he realized, didn't always arrive with proof. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet certainty that refused to be argued away. As the house settled into silence, memories surfaced uninvited. Small moments he dismissed at the time now replayed with sharper edges. Emily staying late at her parents' house more often than usual. Dinners reheated instead of shared. Her phone always face down. Her laughter reserved for someone else, somewhere else. He remembered asking her once if everything was okay and accepting her quick smile as an answer. Back then, trust had felt effortless. Now, it felt naive. By morning, Jack knew one thing. He couldn't confront her again without facts. Whatever this was, it was already bigger than emotion. He needed clarity before accusations turned into mistakes he couldn't undo. So he did what he'd always done. When faced with uncertainty, he stayed quiet and started looking. While Emily showered, Jack sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, hands steady despite the tension buzzing beneath his skin. He logged into their shared financial accounts, telling himself it was routine, something he'd done 100 times before. At first, everything looked normal. Mortgage payments, utilities, groceries. Then he noticed a transfer that didn't belong. A large withdrawal. No note. No familiar destination. He scrolled back further. Another one. Then, another. Different dates. Same pattern. The amounts weren't small enough to ignore, but they weren't reckless either. Carefully spaced, deliberately quiet, Jack felt a slow chill spread through his chest. Emily handled day-to-day expenses, but anything significant had always been discussed. Always. Yet here was money moving without his knowledge, slipping out of their shared life like it had somewhere else to go. When Emily came into the kitchen, towel wrapped around her hair, Jack didn't look up right away. He waited, watching the reflection of her movements in the dark screen. She poured herself coffee, her posture tense, even in the most ordinary gesture. "Emily," he said calmly, turning the laptop toward her. "Can you explain these withdrawals?" She froze, just for a second, but Jack saw it. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then away. "Oh, those?" she said lightly. Too lightly. "That's nothing. Just helping my mom with something. She needed a little extra." "How much is a little?" Jack asked. Emily shrugged, lifting her mug. "You know how she is. It adds up." The explanation sat between them, thin and unconvincing. Jack didn't press, not yet, but something inside him hardened. Lori had never needed financial help, and Emily had never moved money without talking to him first. This wasn't carelessness. It was concealment. Emily changed the subject quickly, asking about his trip, about whether he was tired. Jack answered automatically, his mind already elsewhere. He watched her as she spoke, noticing the way she avoided his eyes, the way her hand trembled slightly when she set the mug down. She finished her coffee and left the room, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the night before. Jack sat there long after she was gone, staring at the numbers on the screen as if they might rearrange themselves into something less threatening. Instead, another thought crept in Daniel, the comfort he'd shown the night before, the way he'd left without explanation, the way Emily had flinched at the question Jack hadn't fully asked. Nothing made sense on its own. Together, it formed the outline of something he wasn't ready to name. By afternoon, Jack felt like a stranger in his own home. Every sound seemed amplified, every quiet moment suspicious. He wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted certainty. Confronting Emily again without proof would only push the truth further away. Whatever was happening, it was already in motion, and he was behind it. As evening approached, Jack closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. His life, the one he thought he understood, felt fragile now, like it could collapse under the wrong word or question. But one thing was clear as his thoughts raced forward. He couldn't stop digging. Not anymore. Because somewhere beneath the lies, the silence, and the missing money, the truth was waiting. And Jack had the sinking feeling that once he uncovered it, nothing would ever be the same again. Jack waited 2 days before making the call. Not because he doubted what he'd seen, but because saying it out loud would make it real. When he finally dialed the number, his hand was steady, his voice less so. Greg Thompson answered on the second ring. They'd known each other for over 40 years, back when business deals were sealed with handshakes and loyalty still meant something. Greg had left corporate life long ago, trading boardrooms for quiet offices and the kind of work that thrived in shadows. Jack hadn't spoken to him in years, but some bonds didn't require maintenance. "I need help," Jack said after the briefest greeting. "And I need discretion." Greg didn't ask questions over the phone. They met that evening in Greg's office, a narrow space above a print shop, the air smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. Jack laid everything out the night he came home early. The laughter, the tears, the money. Saying it aloud felt like peeling skin, but Greg listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. "I want you to look into Emily," Jack finished quietly. "Where she goes, who she sees, everything." Greg studied him for a long moment. "You sure you want this?" he asked. "Once I start, there's no undoing what comes up." Jack nodded. "I already feel like I'm living in a lie. I just need to know how deep it goes." It didn't take long. Within days, Greg began calling with updates. At first, they sounded harmless. Emily leaving the house mid-afternoon, not going to her parents' place like she claimed, but driving across town instead, parking a block away, waiting in her car before meeting someone Jack didn't recognize. Always discreet, always careful. Then the pattern sharpened. "She's consistent," Greg said one night. "Same days each week. Same times. That's not random." Jack listened in silence, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles ached. Every call stripped away another layer of denial. Greg described conversations he'd overheard in passing Emily's voice, low, tense, urgent. And then there were the meetings that disturbed him the most. "Daniel's been there," Greg said during one update, his tone cautious. "Not often, but enough." Jack closed his eyes. "What kind of meetings?" he asked. Greg hesitated. "They don't act like mother and son," he said carefully. "Too familiar, too private. Lots of hushed conversations, physical closeness that doesn't make sense." The words settled into Jack's chest like lead. He wanted to reject them outright, to accuse Greg of misreading things. But doubt had already hollowed him out. He spent his nights awake, staring into the dark, replaying memories with a new, merciless clarity. The closeness he'd ignored, the loyalty he'd assumed. He clung to one fragile hope that, whatever this was, it could still be explained away. That his family, broken as it felt, might still be salvageable. But Emily didn't change. If anything, she grew more distant. Her phone never left her side. She smiled less. When Jack spoke, she listened like someone waiting for their turn to leave the room. Each small behavior chipped away at his trust, until even silence felt like deception. Another week passed. Greg leaned back in his chair during their next meeting, folding his hands. "Jack, I'm going to say something you might not want to hear," he said. "You should confront her. Directly. See how she reacts when she knows you're watching." Jack shook his head immediately. "Not yet. You can't sit on this forever." "I know," Jack replied. His voice was calm, but inside, everything was screaming. "Once I confront her, there's no going back. Whatever truth comes out will burn everything behind it." Greg nodded. "That's usually how it goes." That night, Jack sat alone in his car outside his own house, watching the lights through the window. Emily moved inside, a silhouette crossing familiar rooms that no longer felt safe. He realized then that he was already standing on the edge of something irreversible. Avoiding the truth wasn't protecting his family anymore. It was only prolonging the damage. As he turned off the engine and stepped into the night air, Jack made a quiet promise to himself. He would see this through. He would uncover every hidden corner, every lie, every betrayal, no matter how much it cost him, because not knowing was no longer an option. Jack chose the moment carefully, not because he wanted to soften the blow, but because he needed control over himself, over the conversation, over whatever fragile order still existed in his home. It was late afternoon, the house quiet in that hollow way it had adopted recently. Emily stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, when Jack walked in and closed the door behind him with deliberate calm. "We need to talk," he said. She looked up, irritation flashing before she masked it. "Can it wait?" "No," Jack replied. His voice was steady, but there was something final in it. "It can't." He laid everything out slowly. The unexplained withdrawals, the meetings, the lies that didn't hold together anymore. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse, he stated facts, one by one, like a man building a case he never wanted to make. As he spoke, Emily's posture stiffened, her jaw set. The phone disappeared into her pocket like a shield. "I don't know what Greg's been telling you," she snapped, "but this is ridiculous." Jack felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but he didn't back down. "Don't do that," he said quietly. Don't insult me by pretending this is nothing. Emily crossed her arms, shaking her head. You're imagining things. You've always had a tendency to overthink. The words landed harder than he expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were practiced. Jack stepped closer, resting his hands on the counter, leaning into the space she'd tried to claim. I know where you've been, he said. I know you've been lying. This is your chance to tell me the truth. For a moment, she held his gaze. Then something in her cracked. She exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You don't understand, she said. You think you do, but you don't. Then help me, Jack said. Because right now, none of this makes sense. Emily turned away, pressing her palms against the counter as if she needed the support. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, stripped of its edge. There is no thing between me and Daniel, she said quickly, almost too quickly. That's sick, Jack. I can't believe you'd even think that. Relief flickered brief, fragile, but it didn't last. Then who? Jack asked. Because there is someone. The kitchen went silent. Emily didn't turn around. Her shoulders rose and fell once. When she finally faced him again, her eyes were wet, but her expression was resolute, like someone who had already crossed an internal line. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said. I didn't plan it. Jack felt his pulse thud in his ears. Emily, he said carefully. Who? She swallowed. It's someone you know. The words struck him, but not hard enough to prepare him for what came next. It's Mark, she said. Mark Reynolds. The name echoed in Jack's head, hollow and unreal. Mark, his former business partner, the man who'd sat at his table, the man he'd trusted with money, with decisions, with pieces of his life. Jack felt the room tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. You're lying, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily shook her head. I wish I were. Jack took a step back, his mind scrambling to reconcile the image of the man he knew with the betrayal now staring him in the face. Mark wasn't just a colleague. He was history, shared victories, shared losses, a bond built over decades. The idea that this man had been sleeping with his wife felt less like anger and more like disbelief, so deep it bordered on numbness. Emily started talking, explaining how it began, how lonely she'd felt, how Mark had understood her. The words blurred together, losing shape before they could reach him. Jack heard the sound of her voice, but not the meaning. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow, as if his body were bracing against a blow it couldn't fully absorb. Stop, Jack said quietly. Emily fell silent. He looked at her, then really looked, and realized something terrifying. The woman standing in front of him was a stranger. Whatever life they'd built together, whatever assumptions he'd carried for years, they were dissolving in real time. You didn't just betray me, he said slowly. You rewrote my entire life without my consent. Emily reached for him, but he stepped away. As the weight of the truth settled over him, Jack understood that this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the collapse of the foundation he'd trusted without question. And as he stood there, staring at the woman he thought he knew, one certainty rose above the shock and grief. Nothing about his life was what he believed it to be, and whatever came next would change everything. Jack didn't remember the drive to the bar, only the weight in his chest that made every breath feel deliberate. The place was dim and familiar, the kind of local spot where no one asked questions, and the bartender recognized the look of a man who didn't want conversation. Jack took a seat at the far end, ordered a whiskey, then another before the first had settled. He wasn't trying to forget. Forgetting felt impossible. He was trying to quiet the noise long enough to think, but the anger wouldn't stay quiet. It simmered beneath the alcohol, growing sharper with every passing minute. Jack stared into the amber liquid and replayed his life as if it belonged to someone else. The early years with Emily, the shared struggles, the nights they'd stayed up planning a future that felt solid and earned. He remembered believing he'd won something rare, a loyal partner, a stable family, a life built on trust. Now he saw it differently, not as a lie exactly, but as a carefully maintained illusion, something that looked perfect because he never thought to question it. The whiskey burned, but it didn't numb the ache. It only loosened the thoughts he'd been holding back. Daniel. Jack's jaw tightened as his son's face surfaced in his mind, the casual comfort, the laughter that didn't belong in a room filled with tears. How much did he know? How long had he known? Jack didn't want to believe Daniel was deeply involved. didn't want to imagine his own son choosing silence over honesty. But doubt had already taken root, and it spread easily now, poisoning memories he'd once trusted. The idea that his family might have been complicit, even indirectly, made his stomach twist. Emily's betrayal hurt. That was undeniable. But the name that echoed loudest in Jack's head belonged to Mark Reynolds. Mark had been more than a business partner. He'd been a friend, a confidant, someone Jack had defended, trusted, and stood beside when others walked away. The thought that Mark had been siphoning something so personal, his wife, his marriage, his life cut deeper than anger. It felt like humiliation layered with grief. Emily had broken vows. Mark had broken a bond Jack didn't think could be broken. Jack downed another drink, his hand steady even as his thoughts spiraled. His phone buzzed against the bar top, the sound jarring in the low murmur of the room. Maggie's name lit up the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice even. "Dad," she replied, concern woven into the single word. "Are you okay? Things felt weird when I stopped by earlier. Mom wouldn't look at me." Jack closed his eyes briefly. "Everything's fine," he lied gently. "Just some grown-up stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." There was a pause on the other end. "You sure?" "I'm sure," he said, though the words felt fragile. He could hear it in her breathing, the awareness that something was wrong even if she didn't know what. That knowledge weighed on him more heavily than the whiskey ever could. After the call ended, Jack sat in silence, the noise of the bar fading into the background. He thought about Maggie, about what this would do to her if it exploded the wrong way. Revenge, he realized, wasn't just about exposure. It was about control, about choosing when and how the truth came out so it didn't scorch everything in its path. He began to plan, not recklessly, not emotionally, but with the same careful precision he'd once used in business. Evidence, timing, protection. He couldn't afford to move blindly, not with Maggie caught in the middle. Emily and Mark had made their choices. Jack would make his with clarity. As the night wore on, one truth settled into place with cold certainty. Divorce wasn't a question anymore. It was inevitable. But the way it unfolded, that was still within his grasp. Jack paid his tab and stepped out into the cool night air, the alcohol buzzing through him but his resolve sharpening by the second. His life was breaking apart, yes, but it wasn't over. Not yet. And as he drove home, a single thought followed him through the darkness. If the truth was going to come out, it would come out on his terms. By morning, the fog of alcohol had burned away, leaving something colder and far more dangerous in its place. Clarity. Jack sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Emily had already left no note, no explanation, and for the first time, her absence felt like permission rather than loss. He called Greg before 9. "I'm ready," Jack said. "I want everything." Greg didn't ask what he meant. They met later that day, folders spreading across the small desk in Greg's office, like pieces of a puzzle that had finally revealed its shape. Phone records, surveillance logs, dates, times, locations. Emily's affair with Mark Reynolds wasn't just emotional, it was methodical. Planned lunches that lasted hours, hotel stays disguised as conferences, money transfers that lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. Jack studied the evidence in silence, his jaw set. Each detail fed the anger he'd been trying to contain, but it no longer burned wildly. It sharpened. "I don't just want out," Jack said finally. "I want the truth exposed, all of it." Greg nodded. "Then we do this clean. Legal. No shortcuts." Jack understood that. Revenge didn't mean chaos. It meant precision. He began reorganizing his finances that same week, moving quietly, carefully, accounts separated, assets documented, passwords changed. He gathered emails, statements, and records, building a foundation that would hold up under scrutiny. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he'd surrendered without realizing it. There were moments when the rage surged unexpectedly, when he remembered Emily's voice, Mark's name, Daniel's silence. Those moments threatened to pull him off course. But Jack had learned something important. Anger could either consume you, or it could fuel you. He chose the latter. At night, when the house grew still, he allowed himself to feel the grief, the loss of the life he thought he'd earned, the trust he'd given freely. But even then, Beneath the sadness, there was resolve. He wasn't drifting anymore. He was moving forward. The meeting with his lawyer took place in a glass-walled office downtown, sunlight cutting sharply across polished wood. Jack laid everything out: evidence, timelines, suspicions. The lawyer listened carefully, asking pointed questions, nodding slowly. "This isn't just infidelity," she said at last. "This is leverage." Jack felt something shift inside him at the word. Leverage meant power, control. They discussed strategy, how to proceed, when to file, what to protect first. Jack asked about Maggie, about minimizing collateral damage. He wasn't interested in destroying his family, only in dismantling the lie at its center. "You're in a strong position," the lawyer said. "But you need to be patient." Patience, Jack realized, was no longer weakness. It was discipline. When he left the office, the city felt different, louder, sharper, alive. For months, he'd been reacting, absorbing blows, questioning himself. Now, he was setting the terms. Emily didn't know it yet. Mark certainly didn't. But the ground beneath them was already shifting. That evening, Jack reviewed his notes one last time, organizing them into neat, labeled folders: evidence, finances, legal. He closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaling slowly. A strange sense of satisfaction settled over him. Not joy, not relief, but certainty. He knew what he was doing. He knew where this was going. And he also knew there would be consequences. Exposure always carried a cost. Relationships would fracture. Reputations would burn. Maggie would eventually ask questions he couldn't fully answer. But Jack was done being passive. As he turned off the light and headed upstairs, one thought followed him into the dark. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. And he was finally ready to take it back. The pressure didn't ease as Jack's plan took shape. If anything, it intensified, settling on his shoulders like a weight he couldn't shrug off. Every step forward carried the knowledge of what was coming: the confrontation, the fallout, the irreversible break. He moved through his days with careful precision, but beneath the surface, the betrayal pressed against him constantly, demanding attention. There were moments when he felt steady, almost calm. And then there were moments when the sheer scale of what he was carrying threatened to split him open. Emily, meanwhile, acted as if the ground beneath them wasn't cracking. She went about her routines with unsettling normalcy, discussing groceries and errands, commenting on the weather, asking polite questions about his day. The performance was convincing enough that, from the outside, their life probably looked unchanged. But Jack saw through it now. Every casual smile felt rehearsed. Every neutral tone felt calculated. The more she pretended nothing was wrong, the more aware Jack became of how deeply she had been lying not just to him, but to herself. He began documenting everything. At first, it was just notes in his phone times, dates, brief observations. Then it grew more detailed. Conversations, he replayed later, writing down exact phrases, unscheduled absences, calls she took in another room, meetings that ran long without explanation. Jack wasn't spying out of paranoia. He was creating a record. Each entry reminded him that this wasn't emotion, it was evidence. And with every note he added, the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming widened. One afternoon, he met Maggie for coffee at a small cafe near her apartment. She greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They talked about work at first, about mundane things, but Jack noticed how often she studied his face, how her questions circled the same unspoken topic. "Something's going on at home," she said finally, lowering her voice. "I can feel it." Jack hesitated. He chose his words carefully, like stepping across thin ice. "Your mother and I are working through some things." Maggie frowned. "That's not an answer." He met her gaze and saw the worry there, raw and unguarded. The urge to tell her everything surged unexpectedly, to unburden himself, to let the truth breathe. But he stopped himself. He couldn't be the one to shatter her perception of her mother before the facts were undeniable, before he knew how to protect her from the worst of it. "Just trust me," he said softly. "I'll explain when I can." Maggie nodded, but the unease didn't leave her expression. As they parted, Jack felt the familiar pull of guilt tighten in his chest. He was carrying too many secrets, and the strain of holding them back was becoming unbearable. At home, Emily grew colder. She spent more time behind closed doors, More time away. Her presence reduced to a shadow moving through familiar rooms. Conversations shortened. Silences lengthened. Jack found himself standing in doorways, watching her leave, realizing with a quiet ache that he no longer belonged in his own house. The feeling of being an outsider, unwelcome, unseen, settled in deeply. Each night, Jack reviewed his notes, cross-referencing them with Greg's findings. Patterns emerged. Gaps he hadn't noticed before now seemed deliberate. There was more she wasn't telling him. He could feel it. The urge to confront her again gnawed at him, to demand answers, to force the truth into the open and end the waiting. But experience had taught him that timing mattered. Confrontation too soon would only drive the truth deeper underground. Jack stood at the edge of a decision he couldn't delay much longer. Either he would expose everything in a single, decisive move, or risk losing control of the narrative entirely. And as the walls of his home closed in around him, Jack realized he was approaching a breaking point, one that would demand action, whether he was ready or not. Jack didn't raise his voice when he asked her to sit down. He didn't need to. The tone alone told Emily this wasn't another argument she could deflect or delay. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the space between them heavy and charged, as if the air itself had thickened. Outside, the late afternoon light pressed against the windows, but inside the house felt dim, closed in. Jack folded his hands together, steadying them. "This time," he said quietly, "I need the whole truth." Emily didn't respond right away. She stared at the table, her fingers tracing the wood grain as if she were memorizing it. Jack watched her closely. He had learned to recognize this pause the moment when she calculated what to reveal and what to keep hidden. But something was different now. She could feel it too. He wasn't leaving this room without answers. "You've already decided what you think," she said finally. "No," Jack replied. "I've decided I'm done guessing." The silence stretched. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging, and for a moment Jack thought she might cry again. Instead, she looked up, her expression resigned. "It wasn't just an affair," she said. The words landed with quiet force. She went on, her voice uneven at first, then steadier as if confession itself gave her momentum. "It hadn't been a few stolen moments or reckless nights," she said. "It had been ongoing, over a year. Emocional, financial, intertwined in ways Jack hadn't imagined." She admitted she'd leaned on Mark not just for affection, but for support, money, advice, reassurance. She spoke as though she were describing a gradual drift, something that happened to her rather than something she chose. Jack felt his thoughts scatter, struggling to keep pace. A year. While he'd been planning retirements, family dinners, quiet futures, she'd been building another life alongside his. He pictured the months slipping past unnoticed, each one now stained with a meaning he hadn't seen. Emily kept talking. She explained how lonely she'd felt, how invisible, how Jack had become distant without realizing it, how Mark listened, how Mark made her feel wanted, valued. She said she believed she deserved happiness, even if it meant finding it somewhere else. The words sounded rehearsed, like arguments she'd practiced in private long before this moment. Jack listened, but it felt like standing on unstable ground. The world he'd trusted no longer had edges he recognized. Every memory reshaped itself as she spoke, each one quietly, betraying him all over again. Then her tone changed. Her voice cooled, the vulnerability draining away. "I'm not sorry for what happened," she said flatly. "I'm sorry you found out." The sentence cut deeper than anything else she'd said. Jack looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not remorse, but resolve. Whatever guilt she'd once carried had been replaced by justification. In that instant, he understood something he'd been resisting for months. She had already left this marriage. He'd just been the last to know. A strange calm settled over him. He stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the floor loud in the quiet room. Emily looked startled, as if she'd expected anger, shouting something explosive. Instead, Jack felt emptied of it. The fight he'd been clinging to dissolved all at once. "I've been trying to save something that doesn't exist anymore," he said. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but he raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop her. "I'm done talking," he continued, "and I'm done waiting." He walked away from the table, leaving her seated there, The truth finally exposed, but far from finished. As he moved down the hallway, Jack felt the weight of his decision settle in. There would be consequences. Legal, personal, permanent. But for the first time since that night, he'd come home early. His path felt clear. Whatever came next, he would no longer be reacting. He would be acting. Jack thought he was prepared when he walked into his lawyer's office that morning. Prepared for paperwork, timelines, negotiations, the cold mechanics of ending a marriage. He had already accepted that divorce was no longer a possibility, but an inevitability. What he wasn't prepared for was the way the meeting would rip open a past he thought was settled. The lawyer spread several documents across the table, her expression more serious than usual. "Before we proceed," she said, "there's something you need to see." Jack leaned forward, scanning the pages. At first, the numbers didn't register. They looked like routine financial statements, old business records, profit distributions, tax filings. Then he noticed the discrepancies. Transfers that didn't match agreements he remembered clearly. Accounts he'd never authorized. "These funds," the lawyer continued, tapping one page, "were moved into offshore accounts over a period of several years. They trace back to your former company." Jack frowned. "That's not possible," he said automatically. "We closed everything out years ago." She shook her head. "You closed what you were shown." The words hit him harder than he expected. As she explained, piece by piece, the picture sharpened into something ugly and unmistakable. Mark Reynolds, his partner, his friend, had been siphoning money quietly, methodically, long before the affair began. Money Jack had earned. Money that should have secured his retirement, his family's future. It hadn't been a single act of theft. It had been a slow bleed, disguised by trust and familiarity. Jack felt his chest tighten as the realization settled in. This wasn't just betrayal of the heart. It was betrayal of everything he'd built. "So while he was sleeping with my wife," Jack said slowly, "he was stealing from me too." "Yes," the lawyer replied. "And based on the records, it's been going on for years." Jack sat back in his chair, the room suddenly too small. The memories rushed in business trips Mark insisted on handling alone, decisions Jack had deferred out of trust, the casual reassurances that everything was fine. He saw now how carefully orchestrated it all had been. The affair wasn't an isolated act of selfishness. It was part of a larger scheme, one that relied on Jack's faith in the people closest to him. Emily's words echoed in his head. How she'd leaned on Mark, how he'd supported her. Jack understood now what that support had been funded by. The betrayal was layered, calculated, and deeply personal. His marriage hadn't simply collapsed, it had been undermined from both sides. The woman he loved and the man he trusted had been dismantling his life in parallel, smiling to his face while they did it. For a moment, Jack felt the familiar surge of anger threaten to overwhelm him, but it didn't explode. It hardened. "What are my options?" he asked. The lawyer met his gaze. "You can pursue this aggressively. Financial recovery, legal action, full disclosure." Jack nodded slowly. Divorce alone no longer felt sufficient. Ending the marriage would free him, but it wouldn't address the deeper theft the years stolen. The dignity stripped away. He wasn't interested in walking away quietly anymore. As he left the office, the city felt colder, sharper. Every sound seemed amplified. Every passerby distant. Jack's mind worked relentlessly, reorganizing the narrative of his life with brutal clarity. He hadn't been unlucky. He'd been targeted. His trust had been weaponized against him. That understanding changed everything. By the time he reached his car, the outline of a counterattack had already formed. He wouldn't just expose Emily's affair. He would dismantle the entire structure that had allowed it to happen. Financially, legally, publicly, if necessary. He would take back what was his, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The thought of how far they'd gone, how long they'd lied, fueled something dark and steady inside him. Revenge, he realized, didn't have to be loud. It just had to be thorough. That night, Jack spread his documents across the kitchen table once more. But this time his hands didn't tremble. He made calls, set meetings, asked questions he'd never thought to ask before. Each answer confirmed what he already knew. The battle ahead would be complex, drawn out, and unforgiving. But Jack was no longer afraid. As he closed his laptop and looked around the quiet house, one truth stood clear above all others. He had been betrayed in more ways than he could have imagined, but now, armed with the full scope of that betrayal, he was done playing defense. and the people who had taken everything from him were about to learn just how much he was willing to take back. Jack waited until the house was quiet before asking Maggie to sit down with him. The decision had weighed on him for days, pressing heavier with each passing hour. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head, searching for words that wouldn't shatter her image of her mother while still honoring the truth she deserved. In the end, he realized there was no gentle way to do it, only an honest one. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady despite the tension tightening his chest. "And once I start, I need you to let me finish." Maggie nodded, her expression already guarded. Jack explained slowly, carefully. He didn't raise his voice or assign labels. He spoke in facts about the affair, about the lies, about the financial betrayal intertwined with it all. He made a conscious effort not to turn Emily into a villain, even as the story itself did that work for him. With each sentence, Maggie's face changed, disbelief giving way to shock. "That's not possible," she said at first. "Mom wouldn't—" Jack didn't interrupt. He let the silence answer for him. When the truth finally landed, it landed hard. Maggie stood up abruptly, anger flashing across her face, her hands clenched at her sides. "She lied to all of us," she said, her voice shaking. "She looked me in the eye and lied." Before Jack could stop her, she was already moving toward the hallway. The argument erupted in the living room, raw and unfiltered. Maggie confronted Emily without hesitation, her words sharp with betrayal. Emily's response was defensive from the start, minimizing, reframing, insisting it had been a mistake, something she regretted. But the excuses rang hollow. Maggie wasn't interested in explanations that softened responsibility. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday," Maggie snapped. This was a choice, over and over again. Jack stood at the edge of the room, powerless to intervene. Watching them felt like witnessing a collapse in slow motion, the fracture of something fundamental, something that couldn't be repaired by apologies or time alone. Emily tried to regain control, her voice rising as she insisted Maggie didn't understand the pressure she'd been under. That only made it worse. "You're still doing it," Maggie said. "You're still twisting it so you don't have to own what you did." The words struck deeper than anything Jack had said. Emily fell silent then, her defenses cracking but not fully breaking. Maggie's anger didn't fade. It hardened into something colder, more resolute. She turned away from her mother and walked back toward Jack, her eyes wet but clear. "I'm done," she said quietly. "I won't be manipulated into pretending this didn't happen." Jack felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected, relief tangled with grief. Seeing Maggie stand her ground hurt, but it also revealed a strength he hadn't fully appreciated before. Through months of doubt and instability, she had been the one constant anchoring him, even without knowing why. "I'm with you, Dad," Maggie said. "Whatever comes next." Those words cut through the chaos like a lifeline. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding himself in the reality of that bond. His marriage might have been built on a lie, but this loyalty, this clarity, was real. As Emily retreated into silence, the room felt altered, stripped of illusion. Jack understood then that the battle ahead wouldn't be simple or contained. It wouldn't end with legal filings or financial settlements. It would be about rebuilding something smaller, truer, and far more fragile. His family was no longer whole, but it wasn't lost. And as the dust settled, Jack knew with painful certainty that finding peace would require more than revenge. It would demand resilience, patience, and the courage to let go of what could never be repaired. The knock came mid-morning, sharp and deliberate, the kind that carried expectation with it. Jack already knew who it was before he opened the door. Lori Bennett stood on the porch, impeccably dressed, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that had once commanded rooms and people. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past him as if the house were still partly hers. "I won't take much of your time," she said, setting her purse down with careful precision. "This doesn't have to get any uglier than it already is." Jack closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment before turning to face her. He didn't offer her a seat. She took one anyway. Lori launched into it without hesitation, her voice smooth, measured. She spoke of duty, of vows, of family legacy. She reminded him how long he and Emily had been together, how much history they shared, how children suffered when marriages fell apart, even adult children, she added pointedly. Every sentence was wrapped in concern, but Jack heard the familiar undertone beneath it. Control disguised as reason. Obligation masquerading as morality. "You're a husband," Lori said. "A father. You don't just walk away when things get difficult." Jack listened, his face unreadable. Inside, his patience thinned with every word. He had heard these arguments before, filtered through Emily's voice over the years, gentler then, subtler, but built from the same foundation. Lori had always been the architect. Emily had just learned the blueprint. When Lori paused, clearly expecting agreement, Jack spoke calmly. "You're not here to talk about reconciliation," he said. "You're here to protect your daughter." Lori's lips tightened briefly before she smiled again. "Of course I am." Then she said it casually, almost carelessly. "I helped her when she needed it. Financially, emotionally. I wasn't going to let her struggle alone." The words landed like a final confirmation. Jack straightened. "You knew," he said. Lori didn't deny it. "I understood," she replied. "Emily was unhappy. You were distant. Things happen." Jack felt the anger rise, not hot, not explosive, but deep and steady. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't misplaced loyalty. It was complicity. Lori hadn't just stood by while the affair unfolded. She had supported it, funded it, normalized it. She had helped sustain the deception that had dismantled his life piece by piece. "So while my wife was lying to me," Jack said evenly, "you were making it easier." Lori shrugged lightly. "I did what any mother would do." "No," Jack said. "You did what benefited you." The room fell quiet. Lori studied him now with sharper interest, as if reassessing the man in front of her. Jack realized then how often she'd underestimated him, mistaking restraint for weakness, patience for compliance. That version of him no longer existed. "I'm done," Jack said. "With all of it. The interference, the manipulation, the assumption that my life is something you get to manage." Lori's smile faded. "Be careful," she warned. "You're not as untouchable as you think. This will have consequences." Jack met her gaze without flinching. "So did your choices," he said. "I'm just the one refusing to absorb them anymore." She stood slowly, gathering her purse, her movements stiff now. "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe," Jack replied. "But it'll be my regret, not yours." Lori left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. Jack remained where he was, the silence settling around him. The encounter had drained him, but beneath the exhaustion was something new, a sense of finality. The line had been drawn, not just between him and Emily, but between him and the system of control that had shaped his marriage for years. The road ahead would be difficult. He knew that. Legal battles, emotional fallout, long nights of uncertainty. But as Jack looked around the house, he felt something steady beneath his feet for the first time in months. He was no longer reacting. He was choosing. The first legal filing felt surreal to Jack, like crossing an invisible line he could never step back over. Months of quiet preparation crystallized into action the moment his lawyer submitted the documents. Evidence packets were attached, financial records, timelines, correspondence, laid out with clinical precision. This wasn't retaliation fueled by anger. It was a counterattack built on facts. The asset freeze came swiftly. Emily was served at home, the color draining from her face as she read the court order. Accounts she treated as untouchable were suddenly locked down, every dollar accounted for. The leverage was undeniable. Proof of the affair, proof of undisclosed transfers, proof that she had been moving money while lying to Jack's face. For the first time since the confrontation, she looked afraid. She responded exactly as Jack expected by hiring an expensive attorney and pushing back hard. Accusations flew, motions were filed. Attempts were made to paint Jack as controlling, vindictive, unstable. Months earlier, that strategy might have shaken him. Now, it barely registered. "If it goes to court," Jack told his lawyer calmly, "I want everything on the table." She nodded. "Then be ready. This won't stay private." Jack understood. Exposure was no longer a threat, it was a tool. The fight expanded quickly. Legal action against Mark Reynolds followed, supported by forensic accounting reports that traced stolen funds through shell accounts and offshore channels. Mark denied everything publicly, but the paper trail told a different story. Each new filing tightened the net, and Jack felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion. Momentum. Still, the cost was real. Sleepless nights returned, heavier now, weighed down by depositions, meetings, and the constant hum of anticipation. Some days, Jack felt hollowed out, running on discipline alone. Other days, small victories cut through the fatigue, judges ruling in his favor. Motions denied, evidence accepted. With each win, something shifted. Jack wasn't just surviving the process, he was mastering it. Through it all, Maggie remained his anchor. He made a point of showing up, calling her every night, meeting for lunch when schedules allowed, listening more than he spoke. He shielded her from the ugliest details. But he didn't lie. She saw the strain on his face, the lines deepening around his eyes, and she understood enough to know this wasn't a game. "I'm proud of you," she told him one evening, her voice steady, "for not letting them erase you." The words stayed with him. Then, the media caught wind of the case. At first, it was a short article buried in the business section, a former executive suing a partner amid a high-profile divorce. Then, more followed. Financial misconduct, marital betrayal, court filings leaked into headlines. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. The narrative changed. Jack was no longer the silent husband walking away from a broken marriage. He was the man who had been deceived, exploited, and robbed emotionally and financially. Emily's carefully maintained image began to fracture under scrutiny. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped. Her silence grew louder with each passing day. Jack watched it unfold from a distance, detached but aware. This wasn't satisfaction. It was correction. One evening, after another long meeting with his legal team, Jack stood alone in his living room, the house quieter than it had ever been. He felt tired down to his bones, but also lighter. The fear that had once governed every decision no longer had a grip on him. He wasn't just winning back money. He was reclaiming something far more essential: his dignity, his voice, his right to define the end of his own story. And as the legal battle intensified, Jack knew the most difficult chapters were still ahead. The deeper the truth went, the harder it would be to contain. But for the first time since everything fell apart, he was no longer bracing for impact. He was standing his ground and daring the rest of the truth to come out. The fallout unfolded faster than Jack expected. Once the court filings became public, there was no containing the story. The affair, the financial deception, the offshore accounts details spilled into headlines and conversations alike, reshaped by speculation but anchored in truth. Emily's name began to circulate in spaces where it once carried admiration, now followed by whispers and raised eyebrows. What had been private shame turned into public reckoning. Jack didn't seek updates, but they reached him anyway. Friends mentioned things in passing. Articles appeared in his inbox, forwarded by people who didn't know what else to say. Emily's carefully curated social life collapsed under the weight of exposure. Invitations stopped coming. Messages went unanswered. Women who had once praised her elegance and loyalty now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. The isolation hit her hard. Jack saw it in the small ways: her car missing from familiar driveways, her name absent from event programs, her voice thinner when it finally reached him again. He watched from a distance as her world shrank, not with triumph, but with a heavy sense of finality. This wasn't revenge playing out the way he'd imagined. It was an ending, quiet, inevitable. The call came late one evening. "Jack," Emily said, her voice strained, brittle, "we need to talk." He almost didn't answer, but some part of him needed to hear it. "I don't want this to keep escalating," she continued quickly. "We can still resolve this peacefully, privately." Jack closed his eyes. The word peaceful echoed hollowly. "That time passed," he said evenly. Emily's composure cracked. She talked about mistakes, about pressure, about how things had gotten out of hand. She said she just wanted fairness now, closure, something that sounded like mercy. Jack listened without interrupting, noting how different this conversation was from the earlier ones. Gone was the defensiveness. Gone was the certainty. What remained was fear. "I'm asking you," she said quietly. "Please." Jack felt no anger rise in response. No satisfaction either. Only clarity. "I'm not interested in negotiating feelings," he said. "This is being handled legally." His lawyer, when he relayed the conversation, urged him to push harder. "You have leverage," she reminded him. "This is the moment to secure the maximum settlement." Jack understood the logic. He had every right to take what the law allowed, to press until there was nothing left to argue over. But something inside him resisted. Not out of sympathy, he was long past that, but out of exhaustion. He didn't want to live in opposition anymore. He wanted the chapter closed, not dragged out through endless motions and counterclaims. "I want this done," he said simply. "Clean." Emily didn't accept that easily. Her calls became more frequent, more emotional. She alternated between pleading and anger, insisting Jack was being cruel, then begging him not to destroy what little she had left. Each time, Jack remained steady. He responded through attorneys, through process, through silence when necessary. Watching her unravel was not satisfying. It was sobering. Jack realized then that revenge wasn't the hollowing out of another person's life. It was the reclaiming of your own, and his no longer had space for her chaos. As weeks passed, the noise began to fade. The public moved on to the next story. Emily's desperation deepened, but her reach diminished. Jack stood firm, anchored by the knowledge that he had already survived the worst of it. One evening, he sat alone in the living room, the house dim and quiet. The man he'd been months ago would have felt empty in that silence. Now, it felt necessary. This chapter was ending, not with forgiveness, not with cruelty, but with resolve. And as Jack prepared for the final steps ahead, he knew that whatever came next would be built on something solid, something no one could take from him again. Jack knew this would be the last time. The certainty came to him the moment he scheduled the meeting. No hesitation, no second thoughts. This wasn't about reconciliation or closure in the emotional sense. It was about ending something that had already been dead for longer than he wanted to admit. He chose a neutral conference room downtown. Glass walls, muted colors, nothing personal enough to reopen old wounds. Emily arrived 10 minutes late. Jack barely recognized her. The woman who once moved through rooms with confidence now looked smaller, diminished by sleepless nights and quiet humiliations. Her makeup couldn't hide the strain, and her hands trembled slightly as she set her purse down. Still, there was something in her eyes, a fragile hope, stubborn and misplaced, that suggested she believed this meeting might soften him. "Jack," she said softly, as if saying his name the right way might change the outcome. He didn't respond. He slid a folder across the table. "These are the final terms," he said. Emily opened it slowly. As she read, the color drained from her face. Full asset transfer. No shared property. No financial claims. And then the line that made her breath catch: "Sole custody of Maggie awarded to Jack." This can't be right," she said, looking up, panic breaking through. "You're taking everything." Jack met her gaze calmly. "I'm reclaiming what was taken from me." She shook her head, disbelief turning into desperation. "I made mistakes," she said, "but this is too far. I deserve something. After all these years." "You forfeited that," Jack replied evenly. "Not in one moment. Over time, with every lie." Emily's voice cracked as she tried again, appealing not to the law, but to memory, to history, to the life they'd shared. Jack listened without interruption, not because he was moved, but because he was finished arguing. When she finally fell silent, the truth sat between them, undeniable. "This isn't punishment," Jack said. "It's consequence." The courtroom days later were brief and procedural, stripped of drama. The judge reviewed the evidence, the financial records, the custody recommendations. Emily's attorney objected, argued for leniency, for fairness. Jack sat still, hands folded, his heart steady in a way that surprised him. When the judge spoke, the words were final. The divorce was granted, the settlement approved, full financial control awarded to Jack, sole custody of Maggie confirmed. Emily didn't cry. She just stared ahead, her expression hollow, as if the weight of it all had finally crushed what little fight remained. In that moment, Jack didn't feel victory. He felt release. Outside the courthouse, the sky was bright, almost cruelly so. Maggie stood beside him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. Jack felt the tension he'd carried for months ease slightly, like a muscle finally allowed to rest. "It's over," Maggie said quietly. Jack nodded. "Yes, it is." Behind them, Emily emerged slowly, alone. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Whatever she had hoped to salvage was gone now, not because Jack had taken it, but because she had burned every bridge that led back to it. As Jack and Maggie walked away, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, not all at once, but enough to breathe again. The chapter that had defined his pain was finally closed. Ahead lay uncertainty, rebuilding, the quiet work of healing. But for the first time in a long while, Jack wasn't afraid of what came next. He was free, and as they disappeared down the courthouse steps, one truth settled in with calm certainty. Nothing that mattered had been lost, only what had been pretending to matter all along. The victory didn't announce itself with noise or celebration. It arrived quietly, in the space left behind after the chaos finally receded. Jack and Maggie settled into a new rhythm together, cautious at first, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Mornings became slower. Conversations lingered longer. They cooked meals side by side, not filling the silence, but sharing it. In those ordinary moments, Jack felt the bond between them repairing itself, not by force, but by presence. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't bracing for impact. A few months after the divorce was finalized, he suggested they take a trip. Nothing extravagant, just time away from familiar walls and old memories. Maggie agreed without hesitation, and they left town quietly, no itinerary beyond a loose plan to breathe again. The road stretched out in front of them, and with every mile, the weight Jack had carried seemed to ease. They talked during that drive, really talked, about missed moments, about misunderstandings, about how close they'd come to losing each other without realizing it. There were no accusations, no rehearsed explanations, just honesty, raw and unguarded. Jack listened more than he spoke, realizing how much Maggie had absorbed while he'd been consumed by betrayal. The days passed gently. Mornings with coffee on quiet balconies, long walks without urgency, laughter that came easily, surprising them both. It was the first real break they'd taken in years, free from lawyers, court dates, and whispered conversations. Jack felt something loosen inside him, a tension he hadn't known how to name until it was gone. Emily's presence faded naturally. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no final confrontations. She simply receded, her influence dissolving as Jack's life filled with something else. Purpose, clarity. He stopped checking his phone for messages that never came, stopped replaying arguments in his head. The silence she left behind no longer felt empty. It felt clean. Jack focused on what remained, being a father again, fully and deliberately, showing up, asking questions, supporting Maggie, without hovering. He learned when to advise and when to stay quiet, when to protect and when to trust her strength. In doing so, he rediscovered parts of himself he'd neglected for years: patience, curiosity, joy, in small things. Maggie changed too. With the weight of uncertainty lifted, she began to thrive. Her confidence grew steadily, reflected in the way she spoke about her work, her plans, her future. She no longer carried herself like someone waiting for something to fall apart. Jack watched her with a quiet pride that caught him off guard. She wasn't just surviving what had happened. She was building something new from it. They started new traditions, simple ones. Weekly dinners without distractions. Morning walks on Sundays. Annual trips they planned together, not to escape life, but to enjoy it. These rituals became anchors, reminders that family wasn't defined by the past, but by intention. One evening, after a long day that felt full rather than draining, Jack sat alone on the back porch, the house behind him warm and familiar. He thought about the man he'd been when all this began, confused, betrayed, clinging to a version of life that no longer existed. He didn't feel anger toward that man, only understanding. The betrayal had nearly broken him, but it had also stripped away illusions he'd mistaken for stability. It forced him to confront truths he might have ignored forever. In losing one life, he had found another quieter, more honest, and entirely his own. Jack realized then that revenge hadn't been the point. Survival hadn't even been the point. Growth had come from the wreckage, unexpected and undeniable. The pain had been real, but so was what followed it. As the evening settled around him, Jack felt something rare and grounding. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else's choices. And in that stillness, he understood that the victory he'd earned wasn't loud or dramatic. It was lasting, and it was only the beginning of the life he would now choose, day by day, on his own terms. Jack hadn't planned the moment of reflection. It arrived quietly, the way most truths do, slipping in when he finally slowed down enough to notice them. He sat alone one evening, the house dim and peaceful, and let his mind drift back over everything he'd endured: the betrayal, the anger, the long nights where sleep refused to come, He didn't relive those memories with bitterness anymore. He examined them like a man studying old scars, aware of the pain they once carried, but no longer defined by it. He understood now what the ordeal had taught him. Trust, he realized, wasn't about blind faith. It was about balance, about knowing when to give and when to protect. He had spent years measuring his worth by how much he could provide, how much he could absorb without complaint. That version of strength had nearly broken him. This one, tempered, grounded, self-aware, felt real. Jack was stronger now than he had ever been. Not because he had won in court or outlasted those who betrayed him, but because he had faced the truth without turning away. He had survived the collapse of a life he thought was permanent and built something new in its place. That knowledge settled deep in his chest, steady and unshakable. Maggie's progress made that truth even clearer. Jack watched her move through the world with confidence, pursuing her goals without hesitation. She spoke about her work with excitement, about her future with certainty. Seeing her thrive filled him with a pride that didn't ask for recognition. She was becoming exactly who he had always hoped she'd be, not because he had protected her from hardship, but because she had learned how to stand on her own. For the first time in years, Jack felt proud of himself too. Not in an inflated way, in a quiet, earned way. He no longer carried the weight of old mistakes on his shoulders. He acknowledged them, learned from them, and let them go. The constant self-questioning that had once defined him faded, replaced by clarity. He trusted his judgment again. He began reaching out to people he'd drifted away from, old friends he'd lost touch with during the years when his life revolved around obligations instead of connection. The reunions were easy, unforced. Conversations picked up where they'd left off, free from pretense. Jack found comfort in those bonds, in the reminder that not every relationship demanded sacrifice to survive. The quiet moments became his refuge. Early mornings with coffee and no agenda. Evening walks through familiar streets, noticing details he'd overlooked for years. He learned to sit with himself without distraction, without guilt. For the first time, his life wasn't shaped by what others expected of him, but by what felt right. Jack embraced that freedom fully. The control he once thought he'd lost forever had returned not as dominance, but as autonomy. He chose how to spend his time, who to trust, what to pursue. The future no longer felt like something happening to him. It felt like something he was actively creating. As he stood at the edge of this new chapter, Jack didn't pretend the past hadn't scarred him. It had. But scars, he'd learned, weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of survival. And with that understanding, Jack stepped forward into his new life, not cautiously, not resentfully, but with quiet confidence. He knew now that, whatever came next, he would face it as himself, unburdened and in control. For the first time in decades, he wasn't rebuilding after loss. He was living. Jack chose the house deliberately. It wasn't large, and it didn't carry any of the status symbols his old life once revolved around. It sat on a quiet street, where the evening settled gently, and the neighbors waved without curiosity. The first night he unlocked the door, the air felt different, lighter. There were no echoes of arguments in the walls, no memories clinging to the corners. This place hadn't witnessed betrayal. It was untouched ground. He furnished it slowly, thoughtfully. Each piece had a purpose. Each decision was his alone. Maggie decided to stay nearby without hesitation. She found an apartment a short drive away, close enough for impromptu dinners and quiet check-ins, far enough for independence. Jack didn't ask her to do it. She didn't need convincing. Their closeness now wasn't rooted in obligation or crisis. It was chosen. That made all the difference. Life settled into a rhythm that felt honest. Jack woke early most mornings, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Coffee on the porch, a newspaper he actually read, walks through the neighborhood where no one knew his past, only the man he was now. The simplicity was grounding. No manipulation, no second-guessing conversations, no sense that something was unfolding behind his back. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't on guard. He noticed a shift in himself that surprised him. His thoughts no longer circled the same memories, replaying what he should have said or missed. Instead, they moved forward. Plans took shape easily, projects he wanted to pursue, places he wanted to see, moments he wanted to be present for. The future stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like an invitation. One weekend, he and Maggie packed the car and left town without much of a plan. The road stretched ahead of them, open and unclaimed. They drove for hours, stopping where curiosity pulled them. Small diners, overlooked landmarks, conversations that wandered freely, no longer anchored to what had been lost. They laughed more than Jack expected. At one point, Maggie glanced over at him and said, "You look different." He smiled. "I feel different." They didn't talk about Emily. They didn't need to. The shadows of their old lives no longer followed them. What mattered was the ease between them, the shared understanding that something difficult had ended and something better had begun. Back home, Jack found peace in the quiet. Evenings passed without tension, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. He read, he cooked, he sat with his thoughts, and didn't rush to escape them. The stillness no longer felt empty. It felt earned. He thought about the fight it had taken to get here, the nights filled with doubt, the confrontations, the legal battles, the fear of losing everything that mattered. He hadn't just fought for assets or reputation. He had fought for truth, for dignity, for his relationship with his daughter. And he had won. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood settled into calm, Jack sat on his porch and let the quiet wash over him. He felt no bitterness toward the past, only distance. The kind that allows clarity. He realized then that peace wasn't the absence of pain, it was the presence of self-respect. He hadn't just survived what had been done to him, he had reclaimed himself in the process. "I didn't just survive," Jack thought, the words forming without effort. "I finally became the man I was always meant to be." The realization didn't come with fireworks or drama. It came with calm, certainty. And as the night settled in, Jack looked ahead, not with caution, but with confidence, knowing the life before him was his to live, fully and freely, at last. The community center buzzed with quiet energy, the kind that came from people gathering for something meaningful rather than performative. Jack stood beside Maggie near the back of the room, a program folded loosely in his hand. He took in the scene, the conversations, the laughter, the easy familiarity, and felt a flicker of disbelief at how far they had come. Not long ago, even standing in a room like this would have felt unbearable. Maggie leaned slightly toward him. "You okay?" she asked. Jack nodded, smiling. "Better than okay." They watched the event unfold together, sharing comments under their breath, exchanging knowing looks. Maggie moved with confidence now, engaging easily with people around her. Her posture relaxed, her voice sure. Jack observed her with quiet pride. The uncertainty she once carried had given way to strength, not hardened by bitterness, but shaped by resilience. Seeing her like this made every battle, every sleepless night, feel worth it. As Jack looked around, he realized how different his own perspective had become. There was a time when betrayal had narrowed his vision, pulling his focus inward until everything else blurred. Now, he felt centered. He wasn't scanning faces for judgment or threat. He wasn't bracing for disappointment. He was present. Old acquaintances approached him throughout the evening, people he hadn't seen since before the divorce. Some offered congratulations, others simple warmth. A few mentioned hearing about his new chapter, his calm, his success. Jack accepted their words without defensiveness, without false humility. For the first time in a long while, he felt ownership over his own narrative. He wasn't hiding, and he wasn't explaining. During a lull, Jack and Maggie stepped outside, the evening air cool and grounding. They stood side by side, watching lights glow through the windows. "I'm proud of you," Maggie said quietly. Jack turned to her. "I'm proud of us." They shared a look that held everything they'd endured, arguments, revelations, loss, and everything they'd rebuilt. There were no shadows in that moment, no lingering influence of the past. Emily's manipulations, once so pervasive, felt distant now, like a story that no longer belonged to them. Inside, the organizer approached Jack with a tentative smile. "Would you be willing to say a few words?" she asked. "About your experience, your journey." Jack didn't hesitate. When he stepped onto the small stage, the room grew quiet. He looked out at the faces, turned toward him, strangers, acquaintances, people carrying their own unseen burdens. He didn't speak about courtrooms or betrayal in detail. He spoke about resilience, about truth, about the cost of denying reality and the freedom that comes from facing it. He talked about losing a life he thought was permanent and discovering that loss could be a beginning, not an end. He spoke with honesty, without bitterness, and felt the words land not just with the audience, but within himself. When he finished, the applause was warm, unforced. Jack stepped down, his chest light, his mind clear. As he rejoined Maggie, he felt something settle into place. Closure. Not because everything had been repaired, but because it no longer needed to be. Jack looked around one last time, taking in the room, the people, the moment. He wasn't defined by what had been taken from him anymore. He was defined by what he had built in its place. And, for the first time, standing fully in the life he'd created, Jack knew with certainty that he belonged here exactly as he was. Jack's new life didn't arrive with grand gestures or dramatic turns. It unfolded quietly, one ordinary day at a time. Mornings began without tension, without the low hum of anxiety that had once followed him from room to room. He spent his time on things that mattered, work that challenged him instead of draining him, conversations that felt honest, moments of reflection that no longer spiraled into regret. Peace, he learned, wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of fear. Maggie thrived alongside him. Their relationship had settled into something solid and unforced, built on trust rather than crisis. She spoke confidently about her career now, her plans clear and her voice steady. Jack listened, often in quiet awe, recognizing how much she had grown through everything they'd endured. She wasn't strong in spite of what had happened. She was strong because she had watched him face it without breaking. Seeing that reflection of his own resilience in her filled him with a pride deeper than anything he'd known before. The past still surfaced sometimes, but it no longer held power. Jack could think about the betrayal without feeling its grip tighten around his chest. The memories existed, but they no longer dictated his mood or his choices. He had stopped asking himself how he'd missed the signs. He had stopped replaying conversations, searching for different endings. The questions that once haunted him had lost their urgency. He was free to look forward now, unburdened. One afternoon, Jack walked through parts of the city he hadn't visited in years. Old cafes, quiet streets, places tied to earlier versions of himself, ambitious, trusting, unaware. He didn't feel sorrow as he passed them. He felt closure. The walk became a symbolic farewell, not just to his marriage, but to the man who had lived too long without questioning the cost of his silence. That chapter was closed. Jack's connection to his community deepened naturally. Younger colleagues sought him out, not because of his past success, but because of his perspective. He spoke openly about resilience, about the importance of integrity, about the courage it takes to confront uncomfortable truths. He didn't preach, he shared, and in doing so, he found a new sense of purpose, one rooted in guidance rather than authority. Then the letter arrived. It was unremarkable at first glance, just another envelope among the day's mail. Jack opened it at the kitchen counter, reading the familiar legal language without urgency. The divorce settlement was finalized. Oficial. Irrevocable. He smiled, not out of triumph, and certainly not because of the financial confirmation. The smile came from what the letter represented. An ending. At last, the final punctuation mark on a story that had demanded too much of him for too long. That evening, Jack sat on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The neighborhood settled into its familiar calm. Lights flickered on. A breeze moved gently through the trees. Maggie called to check in, her voice warm, grounded. Jack listened, content. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had gained. The betrayal had tried to define him. It had failed. Instead, it had forced him to confront himself honestly, to choose dignity over denial, clarity over comfort. What remained was a life that felt real, earned, and entirely his own. Jack leaned back, breathing in the quiet. I didn't just rebuild my life, he reflected, the words settling with certainty. I found the peace I always deserved, and for the first time, I'm truly free.